Hello and welcome to a Talmud Israeli production. Today we will review the highlights of this week's course of Daf Yomi study, Masechet Pesachim Daf Ayin Aleph through Ayin Zayin, 71 through 77. 71. Ha-Halel v'ha-Simcha Shmona. The rule is that on Sukkot you have to recite Hallel on all 8 days of the festival, meaning all 7 days of Sukkot plus Shmini Atzeret, and that you have to rejoice in the festival all 8 days. But this rejoicing is conventionally understood as involving sacrificial meats. However, if you say that in order to qualify as a sacrifice which can serve the purpose of simcha, that the slaughter of the sacrifice has to be done at a time when simcha is already required, then we have a problem. There are occasions when you'll only be able to do this on 7 out of the 8 days. For example, Kagon, Shechal Yom Rishon Yom B'Shabbat. If the first day of Sukkot falls on a Shabbos, on a Saturday, when you're not allowed to bring shlamim, which you could eat, then all you would have was days 2 through 8. Well, the solution to the problem is you could rejoice in the meat of the Musaf sacrifices, the Sa'ir, the goat of the Musaf. Amar Rava, Shtei Tshuvat V'Doar. So Rava didn't like that answer and said there are 2 problems with that answer. One is you're not allowed to roast that meat on Shabbat. You would have to eat it raw, and there's no simcha in eating raw meat. Secondly, only the Kohanim are allowed to eat the non-sacrificed portions of the Musaf. What are the Yisraelim going to do? The rest of us Jews who are not Kohanim. To this, the Gemara responds. Rav Papa says, "Misamcho b'chsut nikiya v'yayin yashan." We can celebrate the festival by rejoicing, by having new clean clothing and old wine, and that's how we'll rejoice in the festival. Ayin Bet 72. Masechet Rabbi Tarfon. There was an incident involving Rabbi Tarfon. Shelo ba emesh lebeit midrash. He didn't show up one day to the yeshiva. The next morning, the Shacharit mitzvah Rabbi Gamliel. Gamliel found him. So he asked him, "Why didn't you come to the yeshiva yesterday?" So Rabbi Tarfon says, "Avodah avarati." I was doing a temple service, or rather a sacrificial service, an avodah. To which Gamliel responded, "How could that be? The temple was destroyed. There's no avodah nowadays." To which Rabbi Tarfon responded, "Well, avodat matana eten lach et konatchem. Asu achilat truma begvulin kavodah be'mikdash." That the eating by a kohen of truma, even in the provinces away from the temple, is equated to doing the sacrificial service in the Beit HaMikdash. So even though there's no longer any temple around because it had been destroyed by the Romans, nonetheless, Rabbi Tarfon said, as a kohen, I'm still able to do some kind of avodah. Ayin Gimel 73. Hashochet chatat b'Shabbat b'chutz la'avodah zara. If you were to slaughter a chatat offering on Shabbat outside the temple and for the sake of an avodah zarah, you'd be guilty of 3 violations and have a chatat offering to be brought for all 3. But the question is, why should you have to bring a sin offering for having done this shchita on Shabbat? After all, it's mekalkel b'chabura. It's a destructive act. And if there's no act of rectifying anything, then it should be exempt. What have you rectified in slaughtering this animal on Shabbat for a chatat, for avodah zarah outside the temple? It seems like you've done nothing good. The Gemara answers, Shemotzim de'eva min achai. Well, you did one thing good, in that the meat of this animal is no longer going to be the limb of a live animal because it's dead, and so if a ben Noach, if a non-Jew were to eat it, he would not be guilty of any transgression. So because in that limited respect there was some tikkun here, that's why you'd be liable for a chatat offering for having done this on Shabbat. Ayin Dalet 74. Tana Rabbanan. Ezehu gedim mekulas dasur lachol b'leilei Pesachim bezman hazeh. What is the type of helmeted goat that you are not allowed to eat these days in post-temple era on the night of Pesach? Meaning, the rabbis did not want us to prepare our Seder dinner in a fashion which was extremely similar to the manner of preparing the Korban Pesach, because they didn't want us to confuse the post-temple era Seder with the real thing of the Korban Pesach. So therefore, the Gedim Kulas was outlawed. Well, what is the Gedim Kulas? If you roast the whole animal whole. However, if you were to slice off one limb of the animal and then roast the carcass, or you were to boil even one limb of the animal, the carcass, then it would not be a problem of gedim b'kulas. Why did the Gemara give these solutions to the problem? Because people wanted to do the Gedima Kulas even though the rabbis had outlawed it. And in fact, in certain Jewish communities, throughout the first millennium of the Common Era, it was in fact commonly done. Ayin Hey. The Mishnah says, Sachu b'shemen truma. What happens if you were to baste the Korban Pesach in oil of truma? Im chaburat kohanim yochlu. If this group of eating the Korban Pesach was all kohanim, then there's nothing wrong with it because they're allowed to eat truma, so therefore they could eat it. Im shal Yisraelhu. However, if the Korban Pesach was basted with truma and was going to be eaten by non-kohanim, which would be a problem, im chayu yadichenu. If it had not yet been roasted, if it was still raw, then just wipe away, wash off the truma vimtzli. However, if it was already roasted, yiklo for the chitzon, you'd have to peel off the outer layer of the meat because that outer layer of the meat had absorbed the truma. Ayin vav. Chamisha dvarim ba'im betuma v'nenachalim betuma. There are 5 categories of sacrifice that could be brought in a state of impurity if the bulk of the congregation was impure. However, they are not eaten in a state of impurity. And one of these include ha'omer, the omer brought on the second day of Pesach, the shtei alechem, the 2 loaves brought on Shavuot, lechem ha'panim, the showbread which was consumed every Shabbat, zivchei shamei tzibur, or the communal peace offerings, usiri rosh chadashim, and the goat offerings of Rosh Chodesh. All these things might be brought in a state of impurity if they have to be, but are never eaten as such. However, a Pesach ba b'tumah v'nechal b'tumah. The Korban Pesach can be brought when the community is majority impure. The Korban Pesach can be brought in that state of impurity, but it is even eaten in that state of impurity. Why? Because the whole purpose of bringing Korban Pesach is for the sake of eating it. Ayin Zayin 77. There's a question whether or not when impurity is overridden in a temple context, whether we say tuma hutra b'tzibur, it is permitted, or dechuya, simply overridden. Permitted gives much wider latitude. It's like the law of tuma wouldn't even exist at all. Dechuya means that we recognize the law of tuma exists, it's just that in this instance we're going to relax it out of necessity. So the Gemara here says everyone agrees tuma dechuyahi, it is only overridden, and boy sits the ratzot, the diadem, the head plate of the Kohen Gadol that sits, will serve to atone for the sin of worship, of doing the sacrificial service in a state of impurity. Because the only Tana who ever said the concept of hutra, that it's totally permitted, was Rabbi Yehuda. So the consensus is tuma dechuya b'tzibur, not hutra b'tzibur. Everyone have a great week.